Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. This is wonderful to be back again. I feel like I've come home. It's an exciting thing. I got a little nervous, though, when Mr. Burnett introduced me as the former elder. I was wondering if maybe Mr. Franks had forgot to send me an email or something. So, no, it's good to be back again. My wife, Marlis, could not make the trip. She's working full-time, and I'm going to be here through Tuesday noon, so she couldn't make the trip. Besides that, she said any spare dimes or shekels that we have, she'll be going to Kansas City. For those of you that haven't heard the news, we are grandparents now, have a little baby granddaughter. So we are so excited about that. But anyway, Marla said that she would make the trip here hopefully sometime this summer. The job that she's at is a temporary one and won't be lasting forever. So hopefully maybe even during the camp season we can get back here and Marla can visit with everyone again. So we are loving it. You guys did send us a little bit of bad weather. We had one day of sleet that didn't stick, and that was the day or so after you guys had a pretty good ice storm in December. So I remember that. I was telling the congregation there how the crazy Texans with four-wheel drive trucks that thought they could drive on ice, and it was a good day to stay indoors. So it's a very interesting group down there. The group in New Orleans is kind of metropolitan, very eclectic, very French Cajun. And then the group in Laurel, Mississippi is very rural and agrarian and nothing like the French Cajun. So it's every time I run the circuit, it's like whiplash, seeing the difference in the personalities of the people. And yet you go in and they have the same spirit. Even though they have a different background and a different culture, they still have the same Spirit of God, and it's an amazing thing. So glad to be back here and to see all of you again. I miss having Mr. Westbury sit up there in front. I'll have to try and get a hold of him while I'm here, but so many of the same faces, so it's good to be back and to see you again. Well, for the sermon today, I wanted to start by asking a question. I like to do that anyway. Are you prepared for the end of the age? Are you prepared for the end of the age? I don't know if you've ever thought about this very much, but if the Father were to decide that the end of the age should happen during your lifetime, are you prepared for it? How do you prepare for something like that? If not, are you at least prepared to meet whatever severe trials may arise in your life? During a time of calm, are you prepared for the end of the age? Or are we always living in the here and the now, and we're not thinking about what might happen tomorrow? If you are a person that is headed toward retirement, you should be planning your retirement. If you're a person that is heading toward moving to a different area, you should be planning for that move. So as we head toward the end of the age, are you preparing for that time to come? Turn with me to Matthew chapter 24, a very common place that a lot of sermons end up going to. But I wanted to try and put this into a perspective, perhaps, of some people that were, in essence, living in the here and now, and Christ took them out of the here and the now and started to prepare them for what was to come. Matthew chapter 24, you have to remember what was happening at the time. Herod had a building project going. There were a lot of amazing things that were happening in the Temple Mount area. I believe it was Josephus who said that if the sun would gleam off the building just right from traveling into the city, it would look like the hill was shining. That's how impressive it was. And the disciples were impressed by it. And they say, if you look in chapter 24 of Matthew in verse 1, it says, "Then Jesus went out, departed from the temple, and his disciples came to show him all the buildings of the temple." Look at how impressive this is. Look what's happening here. We've expanded the platform, and we've got this going, and we've got that going. And it was a work in progress, and it was an exciting time for them. But it was the here and the now. Notice what Jesus Christ said back. Verse 2, "I say unto you, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say unto you, not one stone will be left upon another that won't be thrown down." You guys are impressed with what's happening here and now, but I'm telling you, there is a time coming, and it's not too far in the future when that's not going to be there. You're focused on now. I want to get you focused on tomorrow. So let's look ahead and think what it is that we're looking for. So what do we look for, brethren? In verse 3, the disciples then, recognizing that there was more to this story than what they were initially thinking about, says when they went up and sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will these things be?" That's a very specific question. You say this temple area is going to get destroyed. When's that going to happen? That's an obvious. When are we going to enter that time of trouble? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, I don't know, I'm not in their shoes, but I would just imagine they probably thought all three of those questions were one and the same, that they'd all happened together. We know that the temple did get destroyed. We know that the early disciples, the apostles, had to go through persecution and martyrdom, and we know that we haven't reached that ultimate climax of what Jesus Christ further describes in the pages of the Bible. What do we look for, and when will it happen? And when we look at what it is that he's telling us, we recognize that he is telling us to look to the future. And for the ensuing times that come, Christ starts to lay out some specifics. Drop down to verse 9, and let's read what it is that he says is going to happen. This is a part of Scripture that we don't always like to read. Sometimes it is a little frightening when you read this, but it's there nonetheless. It says, verse 9, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation, and they will kill you." Again, we know that all, for what we assume, all but one of the initial apostles were martyred. "And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and then many will be offended, and they will betray one another, and they will hate one another." There is a time coming in the disciples' lives, and I think a time coming in our lives, and obviously if you read the prophecies of the end of the age, there will be a time coming when there will be a lot of trial, a lot of stress, a lot of persecution. Are we preparing for it? Verse 11, "Then many false prophets will arise, will deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will wax cold." People who perhaps were initially on fire for the truth of God, because of the trials that will happen, they'll start to fade. They'll start to get distracted. We can't let ourselves be distracted. And verse 14, "And this gospel of the kingdom of God will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come." But I skipped verse 13 on purpose. I want to go back and grab that. It says, "But if you endure to the end, you will be saved." Jesus Christ was trying to help the disciples understand you will be going through a time of trial. In essence, they would be going through their end-time trial. What I want to do today is I want to talk about this warning that he gives us. You must endure to the end to be saved. Now, as I was preparing this happens. Most of you ladies aren't like this, but the guys are. I'm sitting down one day and I'm thinking through it. I turn the TV on and I've got the remote. The remote is a weapon in men's hands, right? So I'm going through and I can put up 6 TV shows at a time, and I'm just kind of looking at what's going on, and I can click and get another 6, click and get another 6. And as I'm going through that, I happened on a program. Now, I've never seen it. I haven't watched it yet. I just as I was thinking about end-time preparation, I came to the TV series called Doomsday Preppers. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen that or not. I never have seen it, but I know the gist of it. But what I did is I stopped, I turned the TV off, I went to the internet, and I looked up Doomsday Preppers to try and find out what is the idea behind this TV program. And they have a summation of it, kind of a vision statement or a mission statement for this TV show. And as I read this, I thought, well, this is really interesting. What I would like for you perhaps to do is think of yourself or think of the Church of God as we are preparing for the end time. Here's what it says. Doomsday Preppers explores the lives of otherwise ordinary Americans who are preparing for the end of the world as we know it. Brethren, are you preparing for the end of the world as we know it? That is a job that the church has been given to do. Unique in their beliefs. Are you unique in your belief? Does everyone think like you think in the world today? Or are you unique in your belief? Unique in their beliefs, their motivations, and their strategies, preppers will go to whatever lengths they can to make sure they are prepared for any of life's uncertainties. That should be us. We should be preparing now in a time of calm for any of life's uncertainties that will happen to us. Whether they be trials in our lives of health or of job or of family, or whether it's the end of the age if Jesus Christ returns, we need to be preparing for life's uncertainties. Are you prepared for the end of the age? Today, what I would like to do is explore 5 ways that we should be preparing our lives today for trials that may lie ahead. But unlike the Doomsday Preppers, I'd like to be able to look into the Bible and try and figure out how God directs us that we should be preparing for the end of the age. Now, to illustrate these points today, I want to run a parallel story. So you're going to see me go left and go into a parallel story and then right and draw some parallels to that. So we're going to have two story flows going side by side. One of them is I'm going to be reading from a book of a family that did have to go through something very similar to an end-of-the-age trial, and how they dealt with it. A Sabbath-keeping family that went through some very serious trials. And then as I talk about this story, I want to draw parallels, and I want you to be able to make the connections between what they went through and what we might have to go through, and ask the question, how would you handle it if you were in this situation? The book that I'm going to be quoting from is called 1,000 Shall Fall. Is there anybody in here who has read that book? Okay, we have a few. Very interesting book. If you can get a copy of it, it is I think is well worth a read. 1,000 Shall Fall. It's by Susie Hazel Mundy, M-U-N-D-Y. Now, there are two books called 1,000 Shall Fall. You have to get the right one if you're going to go get it. But it was a very interesting story. What it does is it details the persecution of a Sabbath-keeping family that just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. In 1939, they were in Nazi Germany as a Seventh-day Adventist family, and then had to deal with all of the events surrounding World War II, living in Frankfurt, Germany. The lady that wrote it is the youngest daughter of Franz and Helene Hazel. You're going to hear me talk about Franz and Helene a lot on purpose. I'm going to divide those two people because they had very different experiences during the Second World War, who were living in Frankfurt, Germany at the start of the war. In the foreword to the book, Susie, who again is the youngest daughter, wrote something that immediately caught my attention as I was poised to read the book, and it seeded the SPS for this sermon. She says in the very last sentence of the introduction or of the foreword to this book, she says, "It is my hope that this book will be an encouragement to God's people during the time of the end." See, we all recognize that at some point in time it's going to happen. Are you being prepared right now? Are you preparing yourselves for the time of the end? I would like to have you project yourself as we go through the story today, again, into what Franz and Helene were going through, but then draw the parallel and say, what if I were Franz? What if I were Helene? And how would I have handled the same things? So let's talk about the trials that they were facing. 1939, their trial was a rising superpower in Europe. You know what Hitler was trying to do? He was trying to start a millennial reign. He wanted a 1,000-year Reich, and I think in his mind he felt like he was the legitimate heir to get that started, and he was going to do his best to try and start, as it were, a millennial reign of peace on the earth. Peace his way, of course. So there is a rising superpower starting in 1939 in Europe. We know from scriptures, and we'll read those in just a little while, that that's going to happen again. There's going to be another superpower rise in Europe. Their nation was changed from a peaceful and tolerant nation, at least for Sabbath keepers, into a war state. And when the war happened, all of the peace and understanding that were regard to Sabbath-keeping people went by the wayside, and how they had to deal with that. We have a pretty peaceful life here in the United States. I know that we complain a lot about trials that we have, and we do. We have health trials, family trials, job trials. But when we go through this book, I think you'll probably realize that what they were going through is so much more intense than what we deal with in our day-to-day lives. And then recognize the fact that once the conditions start to deteriorate in the world scene, that we will have to be preparing for that ourselves. What will it be like for God's people who live in Europe? Have you ever thought of that? Sometimes we think about the end time and we think about it from an American perspective. There are brethren in the Church of God that live in Europe, and they will be in the midst of that, just like we'll be reading about what Franz and Helene had to go through as Sabbath keepers, in the middle of the beast power, not a nation that they may subdue, but right in the middle of it. What will it be like for God's people in Europe during those times? What will it be like for God's people in the countries that fall to the beast power? What will it be like? Their religious practices at the time in 1939 started to look very Jewish and very non-Catholic. Now, if you can think about what Germany was like at that time, to be Jewish or non-Catholic was a very bad thing. And all of a sudden, this peace that they had, this relative peace, all of a sudden they were suspect, and they were suspect at every turn based on their beliefs. We know that there will come a time when people who don't conform to the accepted beast power religion will suffer persecution. That will happen. The time is coming, the Bible tells us, when even buying and selling will be regulated by whether or not you sign up to the beast party. Now, I say it that way because I'm going to read something in the book about signing up to a party. If we don't sign up to the beast party, then people will not be able to buy and sell. So again, what I would like for us to do today is to draw the parallels between what Franz and Helene had to go through and what we may have to go through. So I've got 5 points today that I'd like to go through to talk about preparing for the end of the age. And here's point number 1. It says, know for certain the end is coming. Know for certain the end is coming. Sometimes we get so complacent in our lives here today that we may not always recognize the fact that the end of the age is prophesied to come, and it may indeed happen in our lifetimes, and we need to be prepared for the fact that end is coming. I'm going to be reading a lot from the book today. I hope that doesn't bother anyone. I think you'll find it motivating as we go through it. It's a captivating book. It's one of those page turners. I'm not one that usually can sit and read straight through a book. I read for 15 or 20 minutes, and then I've got to go get a sandwich, and I read for 15 or 20 minutes, and I've got to go take a walk. I just can't stay focused. This was different. This was one of those I sat down in the chair, and I didn't get up until it was done. Hopefully you'll get drawn into the book as well as we go through this. Starting out, it says, by 1939, Franz and Helene Hasel and their neighbors knew that Adolf Hitler was indeed preparing for war. And like everyone else, the little Seventh-day Adventist family had been wondering what the future would hold, and they were about to find out. I get people that send me links to European news and things that are happening, and every time you read that, you have to wonder in the back of your mind, how's this going to work out? Is this event that's happening right now going to be the shot heard around the world that will start another world war? I mean, you're always kind of wondering how things are going to play out. Franz and Helene were seeing the war machine get started, and they were wondering what this was going to mean to them and to their community. Looking at the mail one day, Franz paused, peering closely at an official-looking envelope. Franz's voice, usually so confident, sounded dazed and thick. It's a letter from the draft board. I have been summoned to the Army Recruitment Center in Frankfurt on Monday morning at 8 o'clock. He got this on Sunday, actually got it on Saturday. He didn't want to open the mail on the Sabbath. So he read it either Saturday night or Sunday morning, and he had to report for active duty on Monday morning. He has 1 day to prepare. He muttered to himself, but I'm 40 years old. I mean, how could they? Anytime that you draft people into the military, you're going to draft the young guys. You don't draft 40-year-olds. Well, Hitler's war machine did not discriminate by age, and so Franz at age 40 was being drafted into the army. As he went down to central Frankfurt, he was surprised at the near carnival atmosphere that reigned at the central train station. That's where they all had to sign up. One train that was steaming out of the station had a thunderous roar of the German battle cry. And I don't speak German, so pardon me for this, but I think you'll know what I'm saying. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one empire, one victory. Sieg Heil. You can if you've watched any World War II movies, you can see almost this whipped up frenzy of people as they're talking about this great war machine that is being built up. He looked in stark terror at what was happening, and a shock coursed through Franz. Hitler's demonic power of suggestion has captured the masses, he thought. They are convinced that the war will be over by Christmas and that Germans will soon rule a better world. So they were preparing for what was happening, and he was seeing this power rise in Europe, and it was causing him to recognize the fact that a demonic power had started to take over the German mind frame. Turn to Revelation chapter 13 with me, if you will, please. Revelation chapter 13. As you're turning there, I'll tell a little story of one of the things that they mentioned in the book was that their children, when they would send them to school, were subject to propaganda almost every day. No one can defeat the German army. If they send an airplane, we'll shoot them down because we've got flak cannons that nobody else has. Nobody can beat us. We are this ultimate power, and they were whipped into a frenzy to believe that there was nothing short of absolute domination of Europe and possibly the world, and they were ready for that. I want to compare that to what we know is going to happen in the future in Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. It says, Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet was like the feet of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. You can go back into Daniel and read about these world-ruling empires that were the precursors to this final resurrection of the Roman Empire. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and his great authority. Brethren, as Franz looked and saw a demonic influence reach into Hitler and to the German powers that were coming at that time, recognized the fact that that same dragon is going to be involved in a resurrection of the beast power again. It will happen one more time. And I saw one of his, the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and his great authority. Verse 3, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and the deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled. It even looked like at some point that the German, the beast power would fall or would collapse, and yet somehow it survived it, and it rose up again, and it was being more and more powerful. And all the world marveled, and they followed the beast. For those people that were living in Europe at the time and they saw this rise, there was terror in France, in Poland, in Austria, but there was great joy in Germany over how exciting it was that this power was going to take over the world. So, verse 4, they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, and here's this propaganda like Franz's children would have heard in school, who is like the beast and who is able to make war with her? They're going to be so confident that they're going to win this final end battle that they will be preparing themselves through the propaganda that will be coursing through the veins of the soldiers at that time, knowing that they are a part of this great power, and that this great power has got a lot of things that are going to back them up. You know, Satan will again convince a European conglomerate of nations that they can win a war and rule the earth. They've tried it before, and they will try it again. It's very much like Satan. I believe that Satan thinks, as we know in the book of Revelation, where it says that he went again to try and take over the throne of God. He just keeps thinking, if I just keep pushing at it, eventually I'll get this right. And he's going to do that again, and another beast power will arise. But this beast power is going to be doing miracles, and they're going to be convincing the masses because they're going to have the dragon behind them. Can you imagine how hard that would be if you were living in an area trying to stay true to the truth of God, knowing that miracles are being done around you from a demonic source? How tough would that be for you to stay faithful to God's truth? We'll read about what they had to go through, and then hopefully we can draw the parallel for our lives as well. Verse 6, and he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God. They blasphemed God's name. They blasphemed God's tabernacle. They blasphemed those who dwell in heaven. And it was granted to him, to the beast power, to make war with the saints, that's you and me, and to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe and over every tongue and over every nation. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, except those whose names are written in the book of life. Now, I read that exactly backwards of what that said there, but that's what it's meaning. There will be a group of people that won't worship the beast. Those people are the people whose names are in the book of life. Is that you? Is your name in the book of life? And how can you make sure that you can stand during this period of time? Everyone will worship the dragon except for those people who are true to God's way of life, true to your calling, and will stay faithful and keep your name written in the book of life. And I almost think this is interesting. In verse 9, it says, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. It's almost like they're saying, like the Apostle John is saying, the time is coming. It will happen. And you need to be listening. And you need to be preparing. You need to be thinking ahead. You don't want to wait till a trial occurs to figure out how you're going to deal with it if you can pre-plan for things coming. Just like I said earlier, you don't want to wait until you're ready to retire and say, well, I guess I better start saving some money. You've got to get that done ahead of time. John is saying, if you have an ear, listen, it is coming. They will blaspheme the name of God, and they will persecute his people. And John is telling us, listen, and while it is quiet, we can prepare. Now, there actually are more than these 5, but I'll just mention these 5 because they follow the book well. In fact, at the end, it would be interesting to me if you wanted to do something as a family. You can sit down and say, well, Mr. Sandilands gave 5 points. What other things can we be doing to prepare for the end of the age? Because there are a lot more. I'm just going to give you 5 because they follow the book well. Point 1, know for certain the end is coming. As he was ready to leave for active duty, Franz led his family in a final prayer, quoting again from the book. "Our Father," he said, "I have been drafted to be a soldier. You know that I have no interest in war and in fighting. Please be with us, Father, as our paths separate, and help me to be true to my faith, even in the German army." Can you imagine how tough that would be to try and be faithful to God's law when you're in the middle of a war? "Help me to be true to my faith, even in the army, and help me so that I will not kill anyone." I mean, he obviously knew that that was one of the commandments that he had to stay faithful with, and yet this is the army. This is war. They're expected to kill people. He didn't want to do that. "Please bring me back safely and protect my family from all of the dangers of war while I'm gone." Now, here's what I want to do today. I'd like to somewhat divide the audience. As I read through about what Franz went through, men, I would like for you to think about what you would do if this were you. These various circumstances, not going into the army, but the various circumstances that he had to be dealing with. He's away from his family. Franz didn't know for 4.5 years whether his wife and children were even alive. They were separated. He was on the Russian front for most of the war and had no means of communication back with his family. He's saying this prayer right now: protect them here at home, protect me while I'm gone, and help us to be able to be true for our faith. Women, as I read through this and I talk about what Helene had to go through, I would like for you to consider, what would you do if you were in this situation? Your husband's not here. You're in charge of the family. You don't have him to lean on. You've got to handle this yourself. Are you prepared for that? Children, teenagers, are you prepared? If mom and dad aren't there and you've got to make decisions on your own, are you prepared to handle whatever may come your way? Protect me and protect my family from all of the dangers of war. There may come a time, brethren, when we have to rely on God without the support of parents or spouse. Are we prepared to do that? Are you prepared for the end time? Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. And I want to start in verse 19 when you get there with me. Hebrews chapter 10, we'll start in verse 19. Hebrews 10, verse 19. Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he consecrated for us through the veil, that is his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God. I'll stop right there. We can go to the throne of God comfortably knowing that we have a high priest who suffered for us and is at the right hand of God, and any time that we bring things to him as his people, Jesus Christ, as a slain lamb, is right by his side, talking to the Father about the events that are happening in your life. You have confidence that you can go through to God with that assurance that Jesus Christ is our high priest. Verse 22, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. At a time when we may be living in a world that isn't so pure, and this is a very different world than our parents lived in, and a very different world than their parents lived in. The world seems to be getting dirtier and dirtier as we go, and yet we have to be keeping ourselves clean in the midst of a dirty world. When it comes time for this final power to arise again, we have to keep ourselves pure. Verse 23, and let us hold fast the profession of our hope without wavering. You know, I think about what Franz was asking for in his prayer to God. Help me to be faithful to my beliefs while I'm in the army. Help my family to be faithful to their beliefs while I'm away, because I'm not here to help them. And Helene's going to have to handle this by herself. Help us to be faithful. Hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, because he who promised it is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. We know it's coming. Are we preparing for it? This is telling us we have to get our bodies pure. We have to make sure that we are following what it is that he has told us to do. We need to be fellowshipping together. We need to be buoying each other up. Sometimes I think about this great internet age, which is really amazing. We've got a shut-in lady who's able to listen to services every day because she can't get to services, and we hook her up on Skype. But how many people use that as an excuse to stay home instead of coming and fellowshipping? When I come to services, I may come dragging, but when I leave, I'm pumped because of some conversation that I've had at church. I use that time to re-energize myself. And that's what he's saying here. As we see the day approaching, we need to be preparing ourselves. One way to prepare ourselves is to be with brethren of like mind. We need to be studying and praying. We need to be sprinkling our hearts and getting our bodies washed with pure water. We need to prepare ourselves so that we can hold fast to our confession of faith. Before, brethren, we can conquer a severe trial, we have to be prepared. As Hazael saw the day approaching, so must we. Any temptations that we have to recognize that we have a high priest at the right hand of God who can help us through them. Now, what Franz and Helene would have to suffer as a result of their convictions was much greater than anything that they ever anticipated. And as we read through this, you will probably sense the horror that they had to go through as they thought through the events of the times in the 1939, 1940, 1941 time period as World War II was getting going. Brethren, point one, know for certain the end is coming. Point number two, and this may seem an obvious one, but I wanted to talk through this because it will continue to happen and more as the days approach. Prepare to endure ridicule. Prepare to endure ridicule. Reading again, here's Franz. He's on his first day in the Army, and he goes up to his commanding officer. Now, if you can draw this picture, I would like for you to think, how much courage would you have to be able to go to your commanding officer? It's one thing to go to your boss and talk about what he's about to talk about, but this is in the Army to the commandant. This is the general of the Army. To his commanding officer, when he reported to duty, he said, "Sir, I worship God on Saturday as the Bible teaches us to do. I would also like to be excused from reporting for active duty on the Sabbath." Imagine saying that to a general as you're heading off to active battle. "Also, I don't eat pork or anything that comes from pigs. I respectfully request permission to receive a substitute portion whenever pork products are being served." Now, what do you think the commandant had to say about that? Taken by surprise, he was so flustered, he was at a loss as to how to respond. I can imagine it probably took him a while to get his senses about him after such a strange order. Behind him, the accountant and the clerk glanced at each other, rolled their eyes to the ceiling, and tapped their foreheads. You know, we've got a loony on us. But finally, the commandant said, "I don't have time to work with this." He says, "If you can work the details out with the lieutenant, the next guy down, then I'm agreeable." He passed the buck. Well, he passed the buck to the lieutenant. Now, this lieutenant is infamous in this book. If you read the book, his last name is unpronounceable. I'm going to spell it in case you're interested if you read this book. His last name is Gutschalk, something like Gutschalk or something. I have no idea how to pronounce it. But this lieutenant is an infamous person, and he is going to ridicule and persecute Franz for 4.5 years. He has to endure it from that same person. Reminds me when Paul was talking about this enduring trial that he constantly went back to God with, and it just was always this nagging at him all the time. Whether it was a physical ailment or someone following him around and being an annoyance, we don't know. But that's the type of thing. He had this constant gnat, this lieutenant, that was following him around the entire war. So he goes to the lieutenant and he says the same request. The lieutenant said, "You've got to be mad, Private. This is the German army. Our battalion is going out to war, and you want Saturday off?" Under his breath, he spat out, "It's just my luck to be saddled with a religious nut." Are you a religious nut? I have a story that's kind of outside of even the bounds of what I was going to talk about. I was mentioning it to Mark and Heather and Anna Kate Wine this morning. I went to a Prepare and Enrich seminar this last week to get certified to be able to facilitate with that program. And at the beginning, they were just going around the table and saying, "Who are you? What do you do?" etc. So we go around the table and they get to me. I'm the last one. They get to me and I say, "My name's Phil Sandilands, and I pastor a Church of God in the area." And the facilitator said, "I looked you up this week." Didn't say that to anybody else. And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I know more about you than you think." I thought, wow, okay. So he said, then he started asking me questions. "Where do you pastor? I said, well, I have a congregation in Kenner, which is the New Orleans area, and then one in Laurel, Mississippi. Laurel, Mississippi, that's 3.5 hours away. All of a sudden, the conversation shifted on this religious nut, me. And the one lady that was standing beside him, she's a Pentecostal, she said, that doesn't make any sense. That just doesn't make any sense. How can you people do this? And I thought, okay, where's this going, and how am I going to try and turn this back to square one so we can get back on duty? Anyway, the guy said, so what I hear you say is, and remember, this is a guy that had been reading up about me. So every Sunday, he said that with emphasis, you go to Laurel and then down to Kenner. I said, well, no, actually, we observe the Sabbath. I go to Laurel and to Kenner on Saturday. It's a big uproar, right? So anyway, 2 days later, I receive an invitation from an anonymous source to join a cult watch group. Now, I can't imagine that came from anybody else but one of the people that was at this Prepare and Enrich. I could be wrong. It could be just coincidence. But prepare to endure ridicule, because it will happen. As it happened to Franz and Helene, it will happen to you. Finally, the lieutenant says, work out whatever you can with other soldiers. In other words, if you can switch shifts, if you have guard duty on Saturday and somebody has guard duty on Sunday and you can switch, then I'm fine with it. But don't let me see you shirking your duty in any way, the lieutenant says. I will personally see to it that you will live to regret it. And he will. You're going to see some frightening things about this lieutenant. Remember, he says, I have my eye on you. So, again, like I say, the lieutenant had it out for Franz the entire war. So I would ask you the question, who is your Lieutenant Gutzjob, if I'm saying the name right? Who's your lieutenant that's badgering you? Do you have one right now? Some of you probably do. You've got a neighbor or a relative or a boss or a schoolmate or someone that's badgering you about staying true to the faith of God. Who is your lieutenant, and who might that lieutenant be in the future? Turn to Psalms chapter 69. You may think this is a strange place to go because there are a lot of other really good scriptures to go to talk about persecution. But what I want to do is I want to go back and I want to talk about something that David wrote at a time when he was in the middle of persecution and how it felt to him. Anybody that's gone through persecution knows exactly what this feels like. But I think even as the day approaches, it will get worse and worse. So let's read about what it was that David was enduring at the time. Psalms chapter 69, I'm starting in verse 1. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck, and I am sinking deep in the mire. Sometimes you feel like that, don't you? I mean, life has just gotten to you, and you feel like you have sunk in quicksand. There is no standing, for I have come into deep water where the floods overflow me. I am weary with my crying, and my throat is dry, and my eyes fail while I wait on my God. And those who hate me without a cause are more than the hairs of my head. Now, for some of us, that wouldn't be too many enemies because we don't have many hairs on our head anymore. But for others, there are a lot of enemies out there. And David felt like there were as many enemies as he had hairs on his head. That's how bad this was getting for him. Drop down to verse 7. Because for your sake I have borne reproach, and shame has covered my face. Because David stayed faithful to God, he was ridiculed for it. We know that the apostles had to go through that. We know that the people of the church have had to go through that. Any of you who have gone to your boss and asked for the Sabbath or the holy days off for school. I was told when I was in 7th or 8th grade that if I went to the feast, I would fail for the semester. And we had to threaten a lawsuit and all of that to get that changed around. I know that there are people that suffer those things. But David was right in the middle of this, and he said, for your sake, I have borne reproach. If you stay faithful to the word of God, there will be persecutions, trials, and ridicule that will come your way. Verse 8, I have become a stranger to my brothers and an alien to my mother's children. Even sometimes those of your own house can be your lieutenants that give you a lot of grief. I know that things like that can happen. Because the zeal of your house has eaten me up, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. Remember when Christ said, if they hated me, they'll hate you. And that is a truism for us today. If they hated Jesus Christ, they will hate you for establishing yourself in the way of Jesus Christ. Verse 10, when I wept and chastened my soul with fasting, that became a reproach. You know, I tried to pray and fast and get close to God, and you remember that where Daniel prayed, and he prayed in such a way where he was praying 3 times a day, and people saw him. They could look through the window and see him praying, and that became a reproach. Even when he was trying to pray to God, that became a reproach to him. Verse 11, I made sackcloth my garment, and that became a byword for me. Even when I was trying to do what was right, it seemed like everything I tried to do, David's saying, has caused a problem. Verse 12, I especially like this after reading this book. It says, those who sit in the gate speak against me, and I am a song of the drunkards. Hans talked about one Christmas day. The only time they allowed them to have alcohol was at Christmas dinner. And he didn't drink alcohol, but everybody else did. So everybody's getting looped. And so they start singing songs. Well, after more alcohol, the songs turned to, well, let's make up some songs. And so they started writing their own lyrics. And the lyrics they started writing were about Franz. They called him Bible reader. They called him carrot eater because he wouldn't eat pork. They called him all these names, and they were doing it in songs. That reminds me of what was said here. I am a song for the drunkards. That was what he had to endure. Verse 13, but as for me, my prayer is to you. See, David knew where the bread was buttered. He knew what it was that he had to do. During all of this persecution, he had to somehow try and focus that out and put his focus back on where he should be, and that was to pray to God. O Lord, in an acceptable time, O God, in the multitude of your mercy, hear me in the truth of your salvation, and deliver me out of this quicksand. Deliver me out of this mire. Don't let me sink. Let me be delivered from those that hate me, and out of the deep waters, and let not the flood water overflow me, nor let the deep swallow me up. When I read that about the flood waters coming after you, it reminds me of Revelation 12, where it says that Satan chased after the church with a flood, and the earth opened his mouth and helped the woman. It always seems like there's something that Satan is throwing our way. Verse 16, hear me, O God, for your loving kindness is good. Turn to me according to the multitude of your tender mercies, and don't hide your face from me, for I am in trouble. Hear me speedily, draw near to my soul and redeem it, and deliver me because of mine enemies. Brethren, we need to pray for his deliverance during those hard times, because they will happen. It happened to others. It happened to Jesus Christ. It happened to the early apostles. It happened to the church all through the ages. You can read about what the church had to go through in the Middle Ages even. There were some pretty horrible things that occurred to the church. We need to prepare, brethren, because trial, tribulation, and ridicule will happen. I had someone come up to me last week when I gave this in New Orleans and said, well, don't you think that the church will be taken out to a place of safety and we won't have to worry about this? And I said, well, I'll leave that for people higher up than I to make that determination. But I said, I would say this. If you look back at what happened during the Exodus days, the children of Israel suffered through the first few plagues along with the Egyptians. Now, later on, they were protected or saved from them, but the first few were also on Israel as well as Egypt. So I do believe that we will have to prepare to endure ridicule. Point 3, never, ever compromise. Reading again from the book. Later, as Franz went through the supper line, the cook slapped an extra large portion of sausage on his plate. Now, I have to give you the backstory to this because it's really kind of funny. He went to the cook and decided, the lieutenant's not going to help me, but I'm going to go to the cook and see what I can do about getting my portions changed. The cook was incensed because he had to cook for hundreds and hundreds of guys, and how could he, make one meal for this and one meal for that? This was not a gourmet restaurant. So he said, because you did this, you came up and asked me for this, I'm going to make sure that you get the largest portion of pork of anybody else. You're going to get the largest portion. And so he did. Every day when Franz went through the line, he got the largest portion of pork. Now, the cook thought he was doing him dirty. We'll see how that works out. Franz stared down at the rich, grisly meat, and he asked himself a question, and this is, should you compromise on your beliefs? So if you were in this situation, I'd like for you to think about this. You may be in the war for 4 years, and during the war, you are going to get sausage, a piece of bread, and a glass of water. If that's what you're going to go through for 4 years, what do? Here's what Franz said to himself. Should he eat what God had forbidden him, or should he just eat the bread and go hungry? What should he do? Should he go ahead and eat the pork, or just eat the bread and go hungry? At that time, he was reminded of the plight of Daniel's 3 friends when the king ordered them to eat unclean meat. Remember, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to come across something similar to what Franz was going through. Am I going to eat unclean food, or am I going to stay faithful to God's word? He wanted to be strong, but he also needed nourishment. What would he do? Something had to be done. At that time, they were billeted, that's a word that means they were housed, in an apartment directly across the street from a dairy. One day, Franz walked over with this rich piece of grizzly meat, pork, wrapped up in a napkin. And he said to the proprietor, I am going to be stationed here for quite a while, and I would like to set up a bartering system with you. Would you be interested in trading dairy products for pork? Absolutely, the man said. See, he couldn't get pork, but he had butter and milk and cheese and cream, and that extra large portion of pork given to him by that cook was a blessing because he could trade it for even more dairy products and more butter and more milk. So what the cook thought was going to be a problem for him ended up being a blessing. Interestingly enough, they didn't stay there the whole war. About a year or two into it, they had to transfer to an area where they would not have a dairy next to them. At the same moment they were transferred, that cook, who was a problem to him, got transferred out. And the new cook that came in said, absolutely, you be the last one in line every day and I'll give you something besides pork. He was able to go through and not have to worry about that. Find it interesting. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In verse 6. I was reminded of this as I was reading through the book when Hans was reading about what Daniel's three friends had to go through. It reminded me of the scripture, and I thought it would be good to plug it into here. Verse 6, now these things, the things written in the Bible, became our examples to the intent that we shouldn't lust after evil things as they also lusted, that we shouldn't become idolaters as some of them were, for as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and they rose to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Verse 11, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age have come. As the trials occur toward the end of the age, we can look back at those stories that have been cataloged in the Bible, and we can draw strength from that, knowing that as God blessed and protected them and gave them a way out of these trials, so we can too. God will provide us if we will be faithful to him. Look at verse 12. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. For no temptation has overtaken you except as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with that temptation will make a way of escape. There is a way, brethren, to be able to stay with the truth of God, even through trial and temptation. We must never compromise. Talking about Helene now, ladies, pay special attention to this. The family back home faced similar trials. One evening, Helene answered a knock at the door. There stood Herr Doring, a neighbor who had become a party official. Frau Hassel, we have noticed that you are not yet a member of our party. Over the years, I have observed that you and your husband have been exemplary citizens, and I have been sent here to extend an invitation for you to join the Nazi Party. Now, again, as we draw the parallels, what if you get an invitation to join the Beast Party? Right? Draw those parallels as what they were going through and what we may have to. Here's what he said. If you join the Nazi Party, your rations will be doubled, your children will receive more shoes, more clothes, and a winter coat. You will receive a 6-month vacation, and during those 6-week vacation, and during that you will have unrationed food. So if you join the Nazi decision, what does she do? She says a prayer, and I think the strength of this is kind of unusual, and it's where I wanted to try to draw this story down to. She says a prayer. She says, God, don't ever let my children become more important to me than you are. Don't let my children become my idols. Wow, isn't that an interesting conclusion to come to? She's about to lose her children to the state. And she says to herself, don't let my children become my idols. She determined to be faithful in Sabbath keeping and asked God for special strength in the face of this temptation. Now, compromising on God's law would have brought her a lot of blessings. She was hungry enough the way it was. There were constant bombings. There were constant air raids that were going on. This would have provided her. All she had to do was bow down to the power of the beast, and she would be given special blessings. This book is full of miracle after miracle of how this family was able to keep the Sabbath during and throughout the entire war, even though Franz and Helene were separated. So again, point 3, never compromise. God will supply you with a way to be able to stay faithful to him. Point 4, remove temptations. That may seem like a funny thing, but I want to read a story that helps describe this. It soon became apparent that Franz was especially good at target practice. Well, why would that be a problem? Think where he is, and think what it is that they do in the army. They shoot people. So what happens if you're the one that's the best shot? So he's starting to worry about this. He's going through target practice, and all of a sudden he's realizing, hey, I'm real good at this, and that's kind of exciting. But then the horror of it starts to hit him. It's like, uh-oh, there's a problem brewing. Soon he won the admiration of others and became known as the sharpshooter of the company. If you're a man who does not want to kill anyone, you do not want to be the sharpshooter of the company. And that's what he had to deal with. This scared Franz. When he was alone, he often wonders, this is the point, when he was alone, he's preparing, right? He's not in the situation yet where he's having to deal with this. He's thinking through what if scenarios. He's putting himself out there. He's preparing. When he was alone, he often wondered what he would do if an enemy attacked him from behind. That's one thing to see him coming and go hide. It's another thing if all of a sudden you're grabbed from behind with a knife to your throat, and what do you do? And he said, would he instinctively reach for his gun and kill to protect himself? He remembered his promise to God to not take another man's life, yet at this point he didn't trust himself if put to the test. He wasn't sure how he would respond with that pistol sitting on his hip. He just wasn't sure what he would do. There's no time to waste, he said. He hurried down to a carpenter's shop and said, give me a piece of paper. On it, he carefully drew a shape which looked like a wooden bracket. It's in an L shape. And said, can you cut me a piece of wood to this shape, and would you take this soap and chocolate as trade? Of course, said the man, so he makes him this little bracket of wood. Back in the office, Franz took out his pocket knife and began whittling the angled piece of wood until its corners were rounded, and then he opened a tin of boot polish and blackened it until it gleamed. You know what he's doing with it, right? Late that night, under the cover of darkness, he slipped his military-issue revolver into his holster and made his way to a small lake. Once there, he reached into the holster and took out the gun, paused for a moment and said a prayer. God, this is my way of showing you that I am serious about not wanting to kill anyone. If I'm attacked, I will have no way to defend myself. I must trust in you to be my protector. My life is in your hands. And with that, he took the gun and threw it in the lake. He was removing a temptation that he wasn't sure he would be able to withstand if it happened to him. So back at the camp, he took the blackened, polished bracket, thrust it into his holster, buttoned the flap, and this would be the only weapon that he carried throughout the war. He didn't have any other weapon on him. He had a piece of wood stuck in his holster. He had no way of defending himself the entire war. Interestingly enough, it was either that day or a day or two after, another man, similar to Franz's position, mentioned to his captain that he had lost his service revolver, and that man was taken out and shot. So Franz knew that if he was ever caught with that piece of wood in his holster, that was what he had to face. And he went 4.5 years in the military in his holster just with a piece of wood. James chapter 1, removing temptations. James chapter 1, in verse 12. James 1, in verse 12. Sometimes I think, and I'll speak for myself, sometimes I read verse 12 and stop, because this is a kind of an easy thing to be able to make a point out of. James chapter 1 and verse 12. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those that love him. Full stop. A temptation's thrown God puts a temptation in my path. I successfully circumnavigate it, and I'm going to be in the kingdom of God. This is great. I'm going to close the book, and that's all I want to read. Well, let's read a little further because there's more information here. Verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt himself. Okay, so let me rephrase the story. So maybe God didn't tempt me, but maybe Satan did, and I survived it, and I'm going to be in the kingdom. So all is good. Well, let's keep reading. There's more to it. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. I would ask you the question, brethren, what are your desires that entice you to sin? What are your desires that entice you to sin? In a time of calm, remove those temptations. Because if you have an enticement, if you have a desire, and Satan knows that that is a weakness, during a time of trial, he will use that weakness against you. In a time of calm, remove the temptations. If you haven't listened to this lately, I know that Mr. Taylor has done this here. There is a sermon that he did, and I'm probably going to mangle the title, but it's something like Borders, Barriers, and Boundaries. Do you remember when he did that? Turn with me to Matthew chapter 18. I just want to read the quick summation of this and then encourage you for the sake of time to go and find this sermon if you can. Matthew chapter 18 in verse 8 and 9. Christ says, "If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it's better for you to enter into life lame or maimed rather than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into the lake of fire." Verse 9, "If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than to have 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire." The point of his sermon was, if you have a temptation, if you have something that entices you, you need to get that out of your life. He used the example of watching the Miss America Beauty Contest. If you can't look at Miss America Beauty Contest without lusting, then you shouldn't watch the Miss America Beauty Contest. Pluck that eye out and throw it away. Don't let that get rid of the temptations that are in your life. If you're an alcoholic, don't let your foot take you to a bar. Cut your foot off, in other words. Don't let your foot take you to some place that is your trial, that is your enticement. Identify the things that are a temptation to you and work to remove them now while the time has come. Remove temptations, point 4. Point number 5, and my last point, learn to trust God. It may not turn out as you think. Learn to trust God. It might not turn out as you think. Going back to Helene and her children. At one point, Helene and her children fled Frankfurt because of daily Allied bombings. Now, remember, they lived in Frankfurt, and that was a big industrial city, and so the Allies were bombing it. In fact, they ended up bombing it every day. They settled into the countryside at the home of a friend for several months, a friend that was in their church. This place seemed idyllic. The children loved it there. There was no daily bombings, and she decided that she would spend the rest of the war here. And she sent a letter off trying to get it to Franz to say, here's where we are. We're safe. Everything's fine. We're out of the city. Tante Fisher, the name of the lady that was there, Helene said one day in a low voice so the children couldn't hear, "I just have received a letter from the mayor of this small village, and he has written to all of the evacuees from Frankfurt telling us that we have to leave this town and immediately return back home." So she's convinced that she's going to spend the rest of the war here. She's prayed for that. She trusts God, but she's also trusting God that he'll leave her right there. Helene said a special prayer for protection to God, and then she walked to the mayor's house, confident that God would work things out. Now, I'm going to take a little literary license and say she was confident that things would be worked out the way she wanted them to be worked out. She went there thinking, well, I'll go to him, I'll explain the situation, and God will be with me, and we'll be allowed to stay for the rest of the war. To her dismay, he was adamant. "I'm sorry, Frau Hassel, everyone has to leave, and there will be no exceptions." The next day, Helene and her children were forced to leave the countryside for their home in Frankfurt. Catching a train home, they sat silently for the entire journey. Upon arriving at the train station in Frankfurt, an air raid was in progress. Can you imagine? While she finally has to go back home, in the middle of all of that, as she arrives at the train station, the Allies are bombing. With the moaning sirens sounding in her ears, she bundled her children and belongings up for the trip home. "Why, God, why have you made me to leave the safety of the Black Forest and bring me back to the destruction of bombs?" She could not understand what God was doing. It didn't make any sense to her. Sometimes when God gives us an answer, we may not understand it either. But listen to the rest of the story. It wasn't until several years later, when she and her 2 youngest children vacationed again in the Black Forest, that she learned what happened after her departure. Tante Fisher told her, "The very next day after you left, the Moroccans invaded the village. They were maniacs full of rage. They plundered, they destroyed, they set fires, and they systematically went to each house and found every woman from age 5 to 70, and no one escaped their brutality." She was protected by being sent back to the bombs. That's not how she wanted things to work out. But God had something else in mind. He knew something that she didn't. Trust God and let him direct your paths. Isaiah chapter 55. Isaiah chapter 55. There's two scriptures kind of back to back that you would expect us to go to during this time when we talk about this. Isaiah chapter 55, verse 8 through 11. My thoughts, God says, are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. He knows the end game. He knows what's going to happen. He knows where you need to be. He knows what you need to be, what you need at the time to be able to keep yourself safe. He knows for you. If you put your faith and your trust in him, he will take care of this. Verse 10, for as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven and doesn't return there, but waters the earth and makes it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It will not return to me void, and it will accomplish what I please. When God says he will take care of something, he will take care of it. When he says and when he gives you the promise of helping you out, he will help you out, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it. We don't always know. I remember hearing a story of, it was somebody, and I want to say it was in Burma or Thailand, who had never heard of the church, didn't have a radio program, but a plain truth was floating down the river. And he reached into the river and pulled that plain truth out and started reading it and got called by God and became a church member. That is not the way that I would expect to be promoting the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yet he found it through an article, through a magazine in the river. God's way will work, and he will take care of things as he sees fit. Also, if you would, turn to Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3, in verse 5. This actually says that exact thing that I was talking about in point 5. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and don't lean to your own understanding. Helene thought that she knew how this trial was going to end. She was convinced in her mind. I take it to God, and then I go in faith knowing that God's going to let me stay in the Black Forest. God had a different idea. Verse 6, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. And don't be wise in your own eyes. Don't assume that you've got all the answers. That's not the point. God didn't call you to become this great intellectual wisdom that you could try and outthink God. He will take care of you if we allow him to do that. Fear the Lord, depart from evil, and it will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Don't lead to your own understanding. Going back to the story again, this is back to Franz. Men, for you. One Saturday, his troops were surrounded by the Russians. So this is one Saturday. Make emphasis on that. They're surrounded by the Russians. They're about to engage in active combat. Quickly, the lieutenant mobilized the men. Hazel, you and Weber go to the empty dairy and defend our position to the south. This is on the Sabbath, and they are about to go into battle. How would you handle that if you were in that situation on the Sabbath day? Here it comes, thought Franz. He cleared his throat and tried to speak calmly. Lieutenant, today is the Sabbath. I can't participate. Just imagine the irritation from the lieutenant over this guy. Years and years of him trying to get him to do stuff on the Sabbath, and Franz just continually says, I can't do this. This is his nemesis here. What was that, Hazel? I can't participate. I am sorry, sir. The lieutenant was stunned. This is war, soldier, and we are fighting for our lives. I'm sorry, sir, Franz repeated. Hazel, are you refusing a direct order? Yes, sir, Franz responded, standing at attention. The lieutenant turned beet red. I have had it, he roared. This time you will get your just desserts and nobody will be able to save you. After the Germans successfully repelled the Russians, the lieutenant made a notation in Franz's service record that when the war was over, Franz was to be executed for refusing a direct order. Now, the interesting thing about this story is Franz was the company clerk. And as the company clerk, he was required to carry the service records of all of the men. He carried, for the remainder of the war, his execution orders. He never modified them. He was probably tempted. What would you have done when you were in that situation? He was carrying his execution orders, and he carried them all the way to the end of the war and handed them in. I'll read about what happened there too, which is kind of fun. That's right at the very end. That burden he would carry with him for the next several years. He knew that at the end of the war, he was going to face a firing squad. Unless God intervened, that was to keep the Sabbath. That was what he had to do. He knew that he had to die. Helene, back home, faced a similar trial. Ladies, what would you do if you were given this trial? For not joining the Nazi party, Helene, who, by the way, had already been told she was going to have her children taken away. That never happened, but she lived in that daily fear. Had her subsidy check canceled. As a member of the military, Franz could send his subsidy check home to his wife, which he did, and so she was receiving this weekly subsidy check to be able to buy food and clothing. Because she wouldn't join the Nazi party, they took away her only means of money. Again, it reminds me of if you don't join the beast party, you're not going to be able to buy or sell. And she found herself in that situation. They had no way now to buy food, clothing, or fuel. Finally, she wrote to her husband in Russia, telling him of the situation and asking for his advice. After a few days, she received a letter back from the local party official. Opening it, she discovered that she was directed to report to the party office in Frankfurt. Finally, she said, "They got my letters, I'll get my money," and she quickly donned her coat and was headed to what she thought was to get her money. Frau Hassel, the man held up a piece of paper. "Do you recognize this?" She looked closer at the paper and said, "Well, yes, that's the letter I wrote to my husband. How did you get it?" He said, "We take the liberty of intercepting and censoring mail that were written by individuals under suspicion." See, she was under suspicion of being Jewish because she wouldn't keep the Sabbath. "Do you admit freely that you wrote this letter?" "Well, certainly," she replied. He slapped the letter down on the desk and says, "This letter is subversive and it is treason, punishable by death. Leave this office immediately and we'll be contacting you in the next few weeks." So not only does Franz have the death penalty over him, she now does too. And she's going to have to appear before a military tribunal to discuss what's going to happen in her case. Weeks passed. Finally, a letter arrived from the Nazi party in central Frankfurt, and it ordered her to appear before a Herr Springer. So she's got this name. Herr Springer had the reputation of being the most ruthless and cruel of all the party officials. Now, I won't read through all of it just for the sake of time, but you have to realize just how certain she was that she was going to be executed on that day. She had 3 kids. The oldest was 12 and the youngest was 6 or 7. And she pulled all 3 of them into the bedroom, one at a time, and said, "Here are your instructions. You leave if I'm not home by noon, you leave at thus and such a time, you take this train, you get off at that stop, you go 3 blocks, and somebody will be waiting for you." She had set it up. Do you understand? You can't tell any of the other 2. And that one went out. The next one came in. "You leave at this time. You go to this bus stop. You take this." And she had something different for all 3 children, including the 7-year-old, to be able to find their way out of the city. And they couldn't tell each other where they were going, so she hoped at least 1 or 2 of them would make it out and not be able to tattle on where the other one was. She was convinced she was going to die that day. What would you do if you were in that situation? At the Nazi headquarters building, she was ushered into an office on the 3rd floor. Once she approached the desk, she saw the polished nameplate, Herr Springer. So she knew she was at the right place. The man behind the desk motioned her to sit down, pulled out a thick folder. "Frau Hassel, I have documents here that are very condemning. You refuse to join the Nazi party. Your children don't attend school on the Sabbath," on Saturday. Let me read it the way it was written. "And you have written a subversive letter to your husband. Are you Jewish? Why don't you cooperate with us?" "Sir, I am a Sabbath keeper," she said. As she spoke, she said boldly, "In the 10 Commandments, God tells us to worship him on the 7th day and to keep the Sabbath day holy. God's laws are still valid today. I have to keep the Sabbath." She's telling basically her executioner, "I'm going to keep the Sabbath. I'm just going to do it." The man smiled and said, "Well, it so happens that I'm acquainted with the Seventh-day Adventists, my next-door neighbors in your church, and he's a nice guy." He said, "Frankly, I think that all people should be able to worship as they feel like they should be able to." He then asked her to explain what happened to the subsidy check. She explained the whole story and ended by telling him again she would never stop keeping the Sabbath no matter what. He stood to his feet. "Frau Hassel, I admire your spirit. I'm going to check into this. Don't worry, I will make sure that you get the money. You may leave." Stunned, she said, "Well, Herr Springer, I don't know how to thank you. And he stood up and looked puzzled and said, Herr Springer. Oh, he said, no, Herr Springer was ill this morning. He couldn't make it in. I'm his replacement. If Herr Springer had been there, it probably would have turned out very differently. Trust God. It may not turn out like you think. Now, I don't have time to go through all of the rest of it for the sake of time, but I just wanted to summarize some of the things in the story. Over 80% of Frankfurt was destroyed by Allied bombing, but Helene's apartment complex of 6 buildings was never touched and never looted. Some of the only buildings in the entire city that weren't looted. Helene's children never had to attend one day of school on the Sabbath, even though she was told she would lose her children as a result. They go on to talk in the book about air raids would happen every day. 6 days of the week, the air raids were at night. On the Sabbath, the air raids were during school hours. So they had to cancel school for all of the children, not just the Sabbath keepers. Every Sabbath, they never had to go to school. With the exception of one Sabbath where Franz lost track of the day of the week, he never had to break the Sabbath the entire time he was in the war. Neither he nor his family ever had to eat any pork products for 4.5 years. He never had one need to even pull a service revolver out of his holster. Never once. Now, I can't tell you this, but had he not done that, had he not removed that temptation, there would have been, I think, a possibility that could have been used by the powers that be against him, but he never even had the need to pull a service revolver out. Of the 1,200 soldiers in Franz's unit, only 7 came back alive, and only 3 of them never had a scratch. Franz was one of the 3. Out of 1,200 men, he was protected. Now, I'd like to end the story by detailing what happened to his service record, calling for his execution. At the end of the war, Franz was taken to an American prisoner of war camp to await orders. Just to give you a little side story, when the war was over, he was in Russian territory, and if you were in Russian territory, you go to a Russian POW camp. If you were in American territory, you go to an American POW camp, and everyone knew which place they wanted to be, so they were all trying to race to get to the American side so that they could be taken prisoners by the Americans. They thought that would be better. And he did. He made it into an American prisoner of war camp. Attention, the loudspeaker crackled after several days. All men wanting to return to Frankfurt, please report immediately. And he thought, okay, so what does this mean? When he reached the camp, Franz took his papers along with his service record, and he gave it to an American colonel behind the table. Give me your papers, the man scowled. After glancing at them, he said in fluent German, I see here in your service record a notation that you're to be court-martialed after the war. What happened? Sir, I refused a direct order for religious reasons. I keep the Sabbath holy as the Bible tells us to do. Once on my day of rest there was an attack, but I refused to do active duty because it was the Sabbath. You can't be serious, the man said. All throughout the war, you kept the Sabbath in the Nazi army and you survived. Yes, sir, he said. God protected me, even in the German army. Well, that's amazing, said the colonel. I'm Jewish myself, by the way. But in the American army, not even I keep the Sabbath. It's just too difficult. Franz stood at attention and said, Colonel, I recommend you keep the Sabbath. And with that, he was released and discharged back to his family. As a conclusion, I know there are a lot more points that could be made. These are just 5 that fit well with the story. But what I would like to do is end by turning to Psalm chapter 91. Psalm 91, the book title is taken from Psalm chapter 91, and I thought I would just read this as a way perhaps to give us some encouragement. As Susie Mundy said in the beginning, that she hoped that this book would be an encouragement to people of God during the time of the end. As you read this, I'd like for you to think about what Franz and Helene had to suffer through, but I'd also again like to think about what you yourselves may face in the future and draw some security and some comfort from this. Psalm 91. He who abides in the secret place of the Most High will abide under the shadow of the Almighty. If God is your protector, he will keep you in his shadow. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God, and in him I will trust. He will deliver me from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence, and he will cover you with his wings, and under his wings he will take you refuge. His truth shall be your shield and your buckler. You don't need an offensive weapon. You need God to be your shield and buckler. Verse 5, you shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day, You don't have to worry about bullets whizzing over your head or any missiles that may be shot over your head. God will be able to protect you at that time. 1,000 will fall at your side, verse 7, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. He saw 1,193 people fall at his side. 1,000 shall fall at your side, but it will not come near you. Verse 8, only with your eyes shall you look and see the reward of the wicked, because you have made the Lord, who is my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place. No evil will befall you, and no plague will come near your dwelling, for he will give his angels charge over you and keep you in all your ways. Verse 16, with long life I will satisfy him, God says, and I will show him my salvation. Know for certain, brethren, that the end is coming. Prepare yourselves now for whatever persecution or ridicule you may have to face. Never compromise on your beliefs. Remove temptations that you may have now, and learn to trust God, because the end will be your salvation. Brethren, are you prepared for the end of the age?